Today we're making broccoli soup. So this is again a recipe that Jillian requested to learn how to make the broccoli soup. So how I make broccoli soup now is a little bit different than how I made broccoli soup when you were kids. So when you were kids, I used something called Cheese Whiz to make the cheese sauce, which I don't use any longer. So I don't buy Cheese Whiz anymore. I don't use that processed product anymore when I'm making broccoli soup. So the broccoli soup that I make now is more of a vegan recipe, and so it's more non-dairy, doesn't use as many processed food ingredients. So I've already got it started. And so I've got it on the stove here simmering. So you can see in my pot that I've got the soup on the go. So what's in the pot at this point are just the vegetables. So broccoli soup, of course, has broccoli. So it's about 5 cups of broccoli, depending on if the broccoli spears you bought are large or small. You might need 2 to 3 spears to get that much soup. I use the stems. Some people don't use the stems. They cut the stems off. I use them too. I just peel the skin off of the broccoli and crowns and cut them up into small enough pieces. And because you end up blending most of this soup, it really doesn't matter if everything is chopped perfectly. It's just the smaller you chop things, the faster they're going to cook in the broth. So of course, broccoli is a key ingredient. And then just about every soup recipe also has onion, celery, and carrot, and so this one is no different. So broccoli, of course, is the main ingredient, but you've also got onion that adds flavor. So whether you add half an onion, a quarter of an onion, the onion really just brings out the flavor in the soup. So more onion is better than less. Sometimes I just use what's left over. If half an onion's in the fridge, then I just use that. So onion is another one of the big ingredients, and then celery. So 1 to 2 ribs of celery, chopped up and thrown in, and then I put in 2 carrots. I also sometimes will throw in leftovers that are in the fridge that are vegetables. So whether that's some cauliflower, so things that are going to go with the flavors of the broccoli. I wouldn't put in peppers, for example, because that's kind of a totally different flavor profile than what you have in your broccoli soup. But you could throw in some leftover cabbage, some leftover Brussels sprouts. So there could be other vegetables that you want to throw in here. So today I actually had a few leaves of kale that I needed to do something with. So I chopped up the kale and threw that in the soup today as well. So then we're really just boiling the soup. The other thing that I put in is potatoes. So some of the recipes that you find for broccoli soup will call for a thickening using flour and water or a roux kind of mixture. I prefer to use potatoes. So I just cut up 1 potato and put a potato in here. And so the potato gives you extra nutrition than you're not going to get from flour. So I use potato for my thickening agent when I'm making these cream soups. And you may still end up needing to thicken it a little bit more at the end of the day. You can usually increase the thickness of your soup just by boiling it longer and letting more of the water evaporate and the soup reduce, or you can convert to using either flour and water as a thickener or cornstarch and flour. Again, I'm trying to avoid cornstarch, so I'm using more tapioca starch. If I need to use something for a thickening agent, that's all you do. So I've also started saving all of my peels from vegetables during the week, or the ribs out of the kale or the little ends of the onion or the carrots, and been making my own vegetable broth. So I used my own homemade vegetable broth in this recipe, and so the actual broth was a little bit red because I had some beets in that broth. So that made the homemade vegetable broth a little bit brighter and changed the color of it from your normal sort of brownish gray broth. So there's mushroom stems, there's any vegetables that I was cooking with during the week just go into a plastic bag in the fridge, and then every week I just process those, I boil them up, and I have my own broth. So I use my own homemade broth. And then there's also 2 cups, so there's 4 cups of broth in here, and then there's also 2 cups of non-dairy milk. So if you want to use dairy milk, you could. I had oat milk in my fridge, so that's what I used. Some recipes will recommend a nut milk, a cashew milk. So the milk that you use is going to change the flavor profile and a little bit of the consistency. And so that's sort of where we're at. And so at this point, you can either take your soup into a blender and you can blend it. Now, whether you want to blend all of it or kind of 3/4 of it. So it depends if you really want some chunks left in your soup at the end of the day or not. You can use an immersion blender, and you could even use just a good old-fashioned potato masher if you don't have any of those. And so I'm going to use my immersion blender today just to process and break up some of the chunks. And then when you start doing this, you know if your vegetables are soft enough because they either blend up really nicely or they don't. So sometimes you might have to cook a little bit longer. So mine hasn't quite cooked enough because you see there's still quite a few chunks and the immersion blender isn't really doing it. So I am going to pop it into my blender to actually finish that soup. So all that's left to do is add basically your flavoring. So as I mentioned, I don't use cheese anymore, but if you are going to use dairy cheese, you want to use a really sharp cheddar because it has a better flavor than the mild. So the old or the sharp cheddar cheese would go into it. I'm going to use nutritional yeast. So I've got a 1/4 cup of nutritional yeast ready. And then the recipe also calls for 3/4 of a cup of coconut milk. So I've used full fat coconut milk, which is again going to really add to the creaminess and the flavor profile of the soup. And then a little bit of acid. So whether you have some lemon juice or you want to use some white wine vinegar. So I'm going to use white wine vinegar because I don't have any lemon juice that's already ready. And so I don't want to squeeze a lemon if I only need a teaspoon of the juice, which is all I kind of need for this recipe. So a teaspoon of the white wine vinegar. But I do have some lemon zest. So every time that I'm using lemon, I just zest the lemon before I squeeze the lemon juice out of it. I dry the zest and I just put it in a spice jar. So I have lemon zest that I can add to the flavor profile. So I will add that. The other spice that you often find associated with broccoli is nutmeg. And nutmeg goes a long way. So if you want to add some additional flavor other than salt and pepper and the lemon flavoring that we're going to be putting in with the recipe, you can add some nutmeg. And using some sea salt and pepper is really all that you need. And again, put your nutmeg in a little at a time and keep tasting until you have the flavor profile that you're looking for. So hopefully you enjoy making this broccoli soup at home.